Hi, this is Pat Johnson, your sociology instructor. In this mini lecture, we're going to start our discussion of three systems of social stratification by talking about slavery. Now, unfortunately, the authors of your textbook pretty much dismiss slavery as something that is no longer in existence in the world. Unfortunately, that's just not true. There still is slavery in the world. Um, we can see it taking different forms, however, and so in this lecture, we're going to talk about those different forms of slavery. Our author defines slavery as a form of social stratification in which some people are owned by others as their property. That definition in your textbook for slavery is actually a pretty good definition for the first type of slavery we'll talk about, which is called chattel. However, there are other forms of slavery. We'll talk about slavery imposed by the state. We'll talk about debt bondage. We'll talk about human trafficking and servile forms of marriage. All of these types of slavery still exist in the world, unfortunately, and so we will learn about them in this discussion. Chattel is where one person owns another. I always remembered in my sociology classes that chattel rhymes with cattle, and cattle are owned by people, and so chattel is where one person owns another person. When many people think of slavery, they think of the United States prior to the Civil War, where blacks were owned as slaves, and that ending with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Even though slavery in the form of chattel doesn't exist in the United States anymore, it does exist in a few countries in the world. Here's one example. In the West African country of Mauritania, the practice of chattel, in other words, one person owning another, is illegal, but it still exists. So we still find people subjugated and owned by others where they have no rights, they have no property ownership, they are the property of other people. So Mauritania is a good example of chattel still existing in the world as a form of slavery. Another form of slavery is slavery imposed by the state. And this is where oppressive governments impose slavery of their own citizens. One of the forms of slavery imposed by the state was the Gulag system in the old Soviet Union. And if you want to read about this, there was a wonderful book written by Alexander Solzhenitsyn called The Gulag Archipelago, and it's about the Gulag system in the Soviet Union. North Korea presently has slavery imposed by the state. Again, no rights, forced labor, people put into slavery by the state for various reasons. If someone is a dissident against the North Korean government, they might be put into slavery. Another form of slavery imposed by the state is what is occurring in the East African country of Eritrea, and it's in what is called the Horn of Africa. So if you look at this picture of the continent of Africa, this part comes out like a rhinoceros horn, and this little country right here is called Eritrea. And Eritrea has an oppressive government, a dictatorship. Sometimes Eritrea is called the North Korea of Africa. You don't want to be called the North Korea of anything. More people per capita try to leave Eritrea by fleeing across northern Africa and across the Mediterranean than any other country on the planet. The system of government is extremely oppressive. Youth are conscripted into the military or civil service, paid extremely low wages, like maybe $10 a month, can't leave for decades, are forced labor. It is a horrific situation that's occurring in Eritrea, and many people don't even realize that the country of Eritrea exists. So if you want to know more about slavery imposed by the state, do a Google search on Eritrea and find out just what's going on there. Another form of slavery is called debt bondage. And in debt bondage, an employer pays wages to workers that are less than what the employer charges the workers for company-provided food and housing. Now, the picture that you see on this slide is of a song that topped the Billboard charts in the 1950s by a singer by the name of Tennessee Ernie Ford. And the name of the song was 16 Tons. And if you listen to the lyrics to the song, it was about debt bondage in the mining industry in the United States. Miners worked for very low wages. They actually lived in company-provided housing, could only buy groceries at the company-provided store, and the wages they were given were much lower than the cost of housing and groceries, and so at the end of the month they were deeper in debt and they could not leave the employment of the mining company until their debt was paid off. So as one of the lyrics goes, you load 16 tons and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't call me because I can't go. In other words, St. Peter, don't let me die because I can't leave this earth until I pay off my debt to this company. So St. Peter, don't call me because I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store was the refrain to the song 16 Tons. And you can see Tennessee Ernie Ford singing this if you do a YouTube search. It was, again, the #1 song in the country in the 1950s. I believe 56, but you can correct me on that. Another form of slavery still going on in the world, all over the place, including in our country of the United States, is human trafficking. And human trafficking also includes child slavery. So when we think about trafficking, we think about the movement of people. This could be men, women, or children from one place to another for the purpose of performing forced labor. It would often look like this. Imagine you live in a very poor country and there isn't work to sustain you or your family. And so you are promised a job in another country, or you're promised that your child will get a job in another country, that maybe your child will get educated, that they'll be able to send money home. And what's actually going on is not legal jobs. The child may be taken into prostitution, they may be forced labor in a factory, but the child or you are taken into the country illegally. You have no rights, and basically you're sold into slave labor and kept against your will. This is human trafficking. It still exists. It exists very frequently all over the world, including in our country, and it is considered a form of slavery. The last form of slavery I want to talk about are servile forms of marriage. Towards the end of the course, we'll be talking about arranged marriages and marriages based on romance. When we're talking about servile forms of marriage, that doesn't mean the same thing as an arranged marriage. In most arranged marriages, the bride and the groom have a choice. But in servile forms of marriage, their marriage is without a choice. This could be, as the picture shows, where a child marries an older adult. It could be an adult woman marrying a much older man, but there's no choice. Either you'll be thrown out of the family, you might even be mutilated, or your life could be at risk if you do not follow through with the marriage. And so this is also considered a form of slavery. So again, I want you to be familiar with these different forms of slavery. Unfortunately, they all still exist in our world today.